All right, folks, good afternoon and welcome to Cloud Compromise, Lessons Learned from Mandiant Investigations in 2023. Let's start with a quick intro. My name is Omar Lahdan.
My name is Will Silverstone.
And we're both part of the Mandiant Security Transformation Services team, where we focus on incident response remediation, meaning we respond, contain, and eradicate threat actors from cloud and hybrid environments during cyber incidents. We'll break down today's session into three major themes, of which we've seen attackers take advantage of to compromise and abuse cloud and hybrid environments throughout 2023. For each of those, we'll anchor around some incident response case studies, and we'll also talk through some hardening recommendations that can help you secure your cloud as well as your hybrid infrastructure.
Now, if you attended our session last year, we used the same stat to kind of set the stage in that when we talk about protecting against cloud compromise, we don't want to just treat cloud in isolation, in that 99% of organizations are running some sort of hybrid infrastructure, being cloud and on-prem. Now, the other side to that is that attacker motivations and tactics are constantly shifting, where a few years ago it was heavily focused on encryption and ransomware as the primary attacker motivation and what they're going after. What we've seen in the last couple of years is this shift to multifaceted extortion, where attackers are exfiltrating data from organizations and using that to pressure them to pay. We have the stat there from MTrends around the increase in intrusions involving data theft. And bringing that data theft aspect into the fold is, again, where our focus on cloud comes in, as that's increasingly where the most critical data for organizations is being stored. So that's where we want to focus the session today, in that when we think about protecting against cloud compromise, our security approach should take into account that the extended attack surface that includes cloud and on-prem and is heavily focused on identities, that lines between on-premise and cloud environments are blurred and overlapping. And then on top of all that, we have the risk of third-party access and third-party software. And then lastly, that attacks are multidimensional, in that attackers aren't just going after a single cloud platform, but are really focused on targeting organizations' entire infrastructure as a whole.
Alrighty, so what are the three major themes that we'll walk through today? 1, living off the land, how attackers have used legitimate software, tools, and native cloud services for evil purpose. 2, cloud attack surface, an extended attack surface with a cloud and hybrid infrastructure setup. And 3, third-party relationships, how a compromise at a service or a technology provider or even supply chain compromise do result to cloud incidents. Across each of these three themes, we'll walk through numerous case studies as well as takeaways. Takeaways cover tactical controls that address security weaknesses observed throughout each case study. We mapped our takeaways to 4 major pillars. 1, identity, resources, network, and endpoints. Before we get started on our first theme, I want to give a quick overview of how Mandiant categorizes threat actors. Mandiant categorizes threat actors in one of 3 buckets. 1, APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Actors. Those are nation-state sponsored threat actors. 2, FIN, or Financially Motivated Threat Actors. And 3, UNC, or Uncategorized Threat Actors. Every threat actor that we start tracking falls under the UNC group, but they could graduate to either FIN or an APT. It's a long, complex process developed by the Mandiant intelligence team. And as mentioned, we'll walk through numerous case studies. Some of the details related to those case studies have been modified to protect the identity of our clients, as well as individuals associated with our clients. With that, and without further ado, I'll hand it over to Will to kick us off on our first theme, living off the land.
Awesome. All right, so we'll start off with kind of what we mean by living off the land in general, and then we'll get into on the next slide how that relates to cloud specifically. So the general definition from CISA here entails abusing native tools and processes to blend in with normal activity, and then being less likely to get caught because those tools are already trusted within the environment. Now, what does that look like specifically within cloud environments? We'll break that down into 4 kind of key areas. The first one around abusing that trusted service infrastructure. And by that we mean kind of the management platforms and tooling that are used to support and administer the overall environment. So, mobile device management platforms, EDR tooling, remote access support tools. And because these platforms have wide-ranging permissions across the environment, and we have to trust them in order to perform administration, they become prime targets for attackers to go after. The next one's similar around abusing native tools provided by cloud service providers. So in the same way that the Windows version of living off the land could involve using built-in tools like PowerShell, this could be using the AWS CLI or G-Cloud for reconnaissance of a cloud environment. Next one around kind of blending into legitimate traffic. So once I as an attacker have a foothold within a cloud environment, what can I do to maintain that access? So it could be something as simple as creating a new user or admin account, or as we'll talk about in an incident response case study, creating a new virtual machine and then using that to stage attacks from. And then lastly, around abusing trusted locations to bypass MFA, where a lot of organizations are excluding their trusted locations from MFA enforcement. So if an attacker can get a foothold within a cloud environment by deploying a new virtual machine, for example, they can then use that to gain single-factor access to additional resources within the organization. So like Omar mentioned, we'll go through some incident response case studies. Start off with the first one here, and just to kind of set the stage, this was an organization that was processing cryptocurrency transactions on a platform hosted within a cloud environment. And specifically, they had the private keys, usernames, passwords for their production cryptocurrency wallets stored on a platform hosted there in the kind of native secrets management tool within the cloud platform. And so they were doing a lot of things right in terms of protecting access to the cloud platform, and especially to that production credential environment. And what we'll talk about in this case is how an attacker can abuse those management tools, that trusted service infrastructure, to bypass a lot of those common cloud security controls and access the cloud environment. So what we saw here was, first, the attacker was able to compromise low privileged developer credentials and then use that to access things like documentation, architecture diagrams, code repositories. And from that reconnaissance, they were able to kind of get a deep understanding of what the environment looked like, who the administrators were, how they accessed the environment, all this to kind of blend into traffic once they were ready to execute their attack. The other important piece is within a SharePoint site, they're able to identify clear text credentials to a bunch of the organization's platforms, including their mobile device management platform. And all this activity was over the course of a few months, and the next few steps happened once they were ready to stage their attack over the course of a few hours, where they were able to push a script to targeted users' endpoints that was able to exfiltrate session keys from those administrators' endpoints back to the attacker infrastructure. And because these session keys from the administrator's device were already authenticated with MFA, the attacker was able to use them to access the cloud platform, and specifically the credentials that were hosted there. And eventually they were able to achieve their goal of, in this case, transferring a few $1 million worth of cryptocurrency from the victim organization to the attacker-controlled wallet. So that's kind of our modern bank heist version, where an attacker is able to access a cloud platform and use that to exfiltrate data. So we'll go through, for each of these, some takeaways across those 4 pillars that Omar introduced on the first slide. The first one around identity, kind of starting with the basics around really just making sure there's a process within the organization to review and reduce privileged access, both within cloud platforms and really any associated tooling. On the resources side, if we think about how the attacker was able to get access to that mobile device management platform, making sure we're scanning for credentials at any insecure locations, be it code repositories, but also things like collaboration platforms like Teams and Slack and SharePoint and Google Drive. And then these next 2 really focus on securing that trusted service infrastructure. So those management tools that are used to administer the environment. On the network side, especially as a lot of these turn SaaS-based and can be accessed from the internet, making sure we're restricting access to trusted locations only where possible. And then on the endpoint side, really treating those like any other tier 0 infrastructure within our environment that has direct administrative control over other resources, where we're using dedicated privileged accounts, we're restricting network access that we talked about, and then we're restricting access to specific managed and compliant devices. And so to wrap this one up, we talked about how an attacker can abuse that trusted service infrastructure to bypass some common cloud security controls. In this next case, we'll go through how an attacker that has access within a cloud environment can blend into legitimate traffic to then exfiltrate data. So it started off here was the attacker was able to abuse weak authentication methods like SMS, security questions, email, phone call, to reset an administrative user's credential via the self-service password reset portal. And with those credentials, they were able to access the cloud admin portal, and from there, they were able to create a new virtual machine to blend into normal traffic. And because they are now coming from a trusted location on the network and had administrative credentials, they were able to access the organization's credential vault platform that was hosted on a separate virtual machine there. And then using their own attacker-controlled cloud account with the S3 bucket stored there, they were able to transfer the credentials, the secrets from that credential vault platform to their own attacker-controlled infrastructure. And then the last piece they were able to do to kind of complete their goal was to modify a firewall rule on a SQL database hosted within the cloud platform, and then use that to then exfiltrate highly sensitive PII data from the victim organization to their attacker-controlled cloud infrastructure. And so like we talked about in the initial slides, without deploying any encryption, they were able to extort this organization, get them to pay a ransom, just purely from the data theft side. And then just to kind of wrap up with the quick takeaways from this one, on the identity side, where we saw the ability to abuse the self-service password reset portal, making sure, for starters, there's an inventory of how users and administrators can reset their credentials across the organization. And then, for those administrators' users, probably excluding them from the normal process and forcing them to go through a defined approval process for them to reset their password or modify MFA. And then on the other piece there, MFA everywhere, including trusted locations. So like we talked about, where an attacker is able to get a foothold within a cloud environment and then use that to gain single-factor access to additional resources, making sure we're enforcing MFA from all locations, especially for administrative access. On the resources side, one of the common living off the land tactics we talked about was using or deploying infrastructure to then blend into legitimate traffic. So making sure there's a baseline and inventory of how resources are deployed into your cloud environment. Usually that's a infrastructure as code pipeline or some sort of approval process. And then creating targeted detections to alert on anything outside of that process. On the network side, kind of considering how we can prevent that data exfiltration aspect. If this is from servers and virtual machines, making sure we're explicitly blocking egress traffic from servers unless it's explicitly required. And then getting more granular to blocking specific unapproved cloud storage, either at a perimeter firewall level or using some kind of DLP tooling. And then lastly, for endpoints, just kind of making sure we're able to trust the devices that are able to access and make critical changes to our cloud platform. So, making sure that we're enforcing that devices are managed and compliant, and then moving towards that privileged access workstation or secure access workstation model. So with that, I'll hand it over to Omar to go into the second section around cloud attack surface.
Awesome, thank you, Will. So our second theme focuses on cloud attack surface. And as mentioned earlier, with a cloud and hybrid infrastructure setup, organizations have an extended attack surface that needs to be accounted for as part of their overall security program. When you look at an on-prem based infrastructure, your network, your egress firewall is your first line of defense. It's your borderline. But once you move to a cloud or a hybrid infrastructure, that shifts from network to identity. So it's no surprise that when looking at cloud incidents that occurred throughout 2023, identity and credential compromise is the leading factor. So what are some of the key challenges that we see exploited in the wild as it relates to identity? One, lack of identity tiering and separation. Organizations using their on-prem identity store, commonly Active Directory, to manage and administer their on-prem and cloud environments. And what that creates is a single point of failure. If Active Directory credentials are compromised, an attacker is able to reuse those credentials to directly access cloud environments. 2, sprawl of keys and credentials. An excessive use of long-term credentials, such as service accounts across GCP and access keys in AWS. And even worse, when we see organizations assigning default highly privileged roles to those long-term credentials, such as assigning the editor basic role in GCP to a service account, or assigning the administrator role to an access key within AWS. Also, the point that we'll hit on around weak multi-factor authentication. Not just the fact that organizations are using weak MFA methods such as SMS, phone call, and email, but also the fact that organizations haven't locked down from where and how an end user can register a new MFA method or modify an existing method. We'll talk through in our next case study a threat actor that's prominent in circumventing identity controls. UNC3944, also known as Scattered Spider, is a financially motivated threat actor that's been active since at least May of 2022. And they're notoriously famous for 2 main things. 1, obtaining credentials, either through phishing, smishing end users, or 2, calling the help desk and impersonating end users, or even calling end users directly and intimidating them to provide credentials. Also, the second thing they're famous for is living off the land, maintaining access within a compromised network through legitimate tools and protocols. And when it comes to completing the mission, UNC3944 historically focused on extortion and data theft. Then we saw a shift where not only they started stealing data, but also mass deploying ransomware at scale. This will be demonstrated in our next case study. And in our next case study, we have UNC3944 register 2 domains following the victim organization's naming convention. They used the victim organization's name, added -helpdesk.com and -sso.com. Once these 2 domains were registered, they kicked off a smishing campaign, sending end users more than 15 text messages saying, "Hi, this is the help desk, and we need you to use that URL to reset your password immediately." Eventually, a non-privileged user clicks on the link, unknowingly provided their credentials to the threat actor. We see UNC3944 then used a compromised credential to log into Entra ID admin portal. There's a default setting within Entra ID admin portal that allows non-privileged users from viewing the admin console. And if you have that access, you can pretty much view all configurations within the admin portal, as well as privileged role assignments, who your privileged users are, what roles they have, etc. From that, UNC3944 performed a bulk user group membership and role assignment download. They used that setting to identify accounts that they wanted to target, wanted to obtain credentials for. Then we see them kicking off a password spraying campaign against those accounts. And after numerous attempts, they're successful in logging into 2 accounts. One was a global administrator account that was supposed to be the break-glass account, and it was excluded from all multi-factor authentication enforcement. And a second account was the password vault administrator on-prem that hasn't enrolled in multi-factor authentication yet. Then we see 3944 use the global administrator account to log into Entra ID, where they register their own managed and controlled virtual machine against the victim organization's Entra ID tenant. And once it's registered, it starts automatically receiving tooling as well as VPN certificates installed on the attacker-controlled and managed virtual machine. We also see UNC3944 logging in directly into the victim organization's EDR, in this case it was Defender, to whitelist specific malware that would, once installed on endpoint, would automatically install legitimate third-party remote access tools. It's a standard attacker technique to maintain access within a compromised network. From there, we see them log into Intune and use Intune as the method to mass deploy that malware across every single Intune managed endpoint. Then we see them firing up a VPN session on their virtual machine, connecting directly to the on-prem network. And from there, they were able to access the password vault and use the second account compromised as part of step 6 to log into the password vault, retrieving additional administrative credentials, including credentials for a domain admin, as well as the VMware root account. From there, we see UNC3944 move laterally to Active Directory, where they dump and exfiltrate the entire Active Directory database, also known as ntds.dit. Then they moved over to the virtualized environment and encrypted the entire virtualized infrastructure. So what are some of the key takeaways that we've learned from this case study? Enforcing strong phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, not just across our privileged accounts, but across our entire user base. Also developing custom detections against standard identity-based attacks, detections that would identify us or alert us on password spraying attempts, and also the same multi-factor authentication method registered across more than one user, for example. From a resources perspective, reviewing and disabling default insecure configurations across our cloud service providers, but then also across our operating systems, virtual machines, servers, endpoints. From a network perspective, restricting access to tier 0 or trusted service infrastructure tools to and from privileged or secure access workstations. A privileged access workstation should be segmented, isolated, with limited access to the internet and collaboration tools, and only from there, administrators should be performing their administrative functions. And lastly, from an endpoint perspective, restricting endpoint registration to the teams and individuals that actually manage endpoints. No cloud administrator or a non-privileged user should have the capability to register or join their own endpoint or virtual machine into the organization's identity store. So what we saw in this case study is how UNC3944 abused weak identity controls to cause a destructive attack across a hybrid infrastructure. Our next case study will walk us through how another threat actor also causes destructive attack through the abuse of weak identity controls, but within a cloud-only environment. And in our next case study, we have an AWS administrator for this victim organization that decided to work remotely from home for that day. And from there, the administrator is using their own personal laptop to manage and administer the AWS environment. And as part of testing, as part of their role, they create an access key that's assigned the administrator role. And when you create an access key in AWS, you have two ways of viewing the credentials associated with that access key. Either you view it in the console or you download it locally as CSV. And in this case, the administrator downloaded the credentials locally in CSV format. Few months pass by, the administrator is looking for a new job, applying through different jobs, and ends up receiving a job offer through their personal email. And once they open up the job offer on their personal laptop, it automatically executes malware that looks for file strings with specific naming convention, as well as cookies stored on that endpoint, and ships all that data to the threat actor. As part of the data stolen as part of this effort was the access key created 4 months ago. From there, we see the threat actor logging into the AWS account programmatically and executing a series of reconnaissance commands, really to understand the lay of the land, understand what services are being used, where data is stored. And the threat actor comes across the AWS S3 bucket and figures out that there's a ton of data stored within the S3 bucket. And in this case, the victim organization was using S3 to store its entire production database, basically. From there, we see the attacker executing a series of 2,000 API commands to one, delete all the data within S3, download it, and then also create an S3 bucket called ransomware and upload the ransomware note into that S3 bucket. So what are, again, some of the key takeaways from this cloud-based attack where we saw an attacker abuse weak identity controls? From an identity perspective, determining whether long-lived credentials are required. And if they are, that's fine, but we want to limit the privileges and role assignment assigned to them, specifically not assigning default highly privileged roles like the administrator role. Also understanding how they're being used, what services within the cloud across our infrastructure those long-term credentials should authenticate against, and then using that as the baseline to build detections that would alert us of any unusual operational activity. And then lastly, from an endpoint perspective, restricting access to corporate managed, trusted, and secure endpoints. At a bare minimum, this should be applied for administrators. It doesn't matter if they're a cloud or an on-prem administrator. And with that, I'll hand it over to Will to walk us through our third theme, third party.
Awesome. Thank you very much. All right. So I guess on the third kind of theme here, first two we talked about kind of protecting your own cloud infrastructure and the risks and challenges associated with that. The last section here will cover how the risk of trusted partners and third-party software can kind of expand that cloud attack surface even further. So kind of in general, we'll go through what the threat landscape over the last few years has looked like in terms of that third-party access to cloud environments, where we have organizations A, B, and C. They've put in place all their security recommendations we've talked about so far. They've blocked and detected any attacker that's targeted them. And so where you're seeing attackers turn over the last few years, especially as it relates to cloud environments, is going after those third-party attack vectors. First one being those professional and technology service providers, so think like managed security providers, third-party SOCs, that have access across a large number of cloud environments. And so if that third party is compromised, the attacker's ability to pivot from one organization to another is fairly simple. Second one around kind of supply chain compromise, where an attacker can implant malicious code into legitimate tools. Very often we see this as a risk within the open source software community, and especially within cloud platforms around container environments and services. Third one around mergers and acquisitions, where even if you've locked down and secured your own cloud environment, we often see organizations struggle to integrate acquired organizations into their security standards. And so the attacker is able to go through those kind of third-party services to access the victim cloud environments. And to tie that all together, we'll cover our last incident response case study, kind of how a third-party compromise can lead to ransomware in a victim's cloud environment. And what we had here was an organization that was leveraging a third-party service provider that accessed their network via hosted virtual desktops. And that third party was compromised, and credentials associated with them was leaked to a dark web forum, where a second group was able to identify credentials associated with the victim organization and then use that to log into the single-factor virtual desktop environment. And what happened in this case was the attacker was actually able to break out from that virtual desktop to the underlying virtual machine that it was hosted on, and kind of once on the internal network, able to move laterally to a domain controller, and from there had the access within the Active Directory domain to create a GPO that deployed ransomware across the domain. And for this specific organization, they had virtual machines hosted within their cloud environment that were domain joined the on-premise Active Directory. So there's nothing stopping the ransomware from propagating from that on-premise environment to the cloud environment. And when we think about encryption-based ransomware in the cloud environments, this is very often their scenario we see where the compromise doesn't necessarily begin with the cloud, but often there's some sort of on-premise or hybrid component. On the takeaway side, starting off with identity, the overall goal being able to trust the identities that are able to access our cloud environments. And so if that's a third-party identity that's not part of our organization, putting in controls to enforce that trust as much as possible. Maybe segmenting third-party identities into a separate group or identity store to enforce more granular controls on them. Putting in place just-in-time access, where if a third party needs to access your environment, enforcing MFA at minimum, but ideally some sort of approval process for them to elevate to privileged access within your environment. On the resources side, we could probably spend an entire session on the inventory of third-party software and access within a cloud environment and within your environment in general. And then on the monitoring of the external attack surface, in this case really focused on leaked credentials as part of that attack surface, where even if the victim organization itself wasn't compromised, they were still at risk and their attack surface was expanded because a third-party service that they trusted was compromised and credentials associated with their organization were leaked. On the network side, this really comes up as a common challenge for organizations that want to do what we talked about in terms of protecting and restricting access to trusted locations only, but have third parties that need to access their network from outside of that. So really putting in those network restrictions to enforce that third-party access needs to come from specific locations, and then having monitoring in place to identify any anomalous sign-ons or risky users. And then lastly, very specific to the case that we talked about, but very common in terms of allowing third-party access via virtual desktops or hosted applications, making sure we're treating those with the same level of security control that we would with normal managed endpoints, in terms of making sure EDR is installed on those and the monitoring is in place for that environment as well. And so I'll hand it back over to Omar to wrap up the session.
Awesome, thank you, Will. So we walked through the three major themes of how we've seen attackers abuse and compromise cloud, as well as hybrid environments throughout 2023. And we also touched on some takeaways that could have stopped, prevented, or even detected the attacker technique throughout each case study. We'll shift gears now and talk through some foundational security controls that can help you reduce your overall attack surface across your infrastructure. Starting off with identities, specifically privileged account management, continuously reviewing privileged role assignments, and making sure that we're enforcing just-in-time access across our entire set of privileged accounts. No privileged account should be privileged overnight, during the weekend, or even holiday. Also segmenting our privileged identities from our central identity store. An easy way to do this across your cloud service provider is by using cloud-based local accounts that's segmented from your central identity store. Across credential management, enforcing strong, complex passwords, as well as restricting the self-service password reset capability. At a bare minimum, accounts assigned privileged roles should be prevented and restricted from using those self-service password reset methods. And also diligently monitoring for any indications or alerts for leaked or compromised credentials, or even just unusual behavior of an account. Across multi-factor authentications, enforcing strong phishing-resistant MFA across our entire user set, and also locking down from where an end user can modify an existing MFA method or register a new method. A quick way we implement this could be by restricting it to trusted physical networks, where an end user has to be physically present within the office network, and only from there they're allowed to register a new MFA method or modify an existing method. Taking a look at resources, specifically trusted service infrastructure. We cannot blindly trust our infrastructure and security tools, but taking these into account as part of your overall security program. Across configuration management, developing a standard for how and when configuration changes should occur across your infrastructure, cloud and on-prem, then building detections around that to look for any unusual activity, because that could be an indicator that something malicious is going on. Also around backup services, attackers are often targeting backup tools and platforms to delete backups. And if they're unable to delete backups directly, they'll try to modify your retention or purge policies to automatically delete backups. So accounting for those is part of your overall security effort. Across the network, specifically attack surface, automating the scanning of your public IPs, CIDR IP ranges, and domains to look for any exposed managed technologies and services that could be used as a vector against you, but also building playbooks to know what to react to and how to do it if any vectors are identified. Across segmentation, segmenting our network and on-prem, and not just from a network perspective, but also from an identity service perspective. We saw throughout different case studies how attackers are using legitimate third-party remote access tools as a means to maintain persistence within a compromised network. So proactively hunting for any unauthorized and unapproved use or installation of remote access tools across our endpoints, virtual machines, and servers. And adding blocks at the egress level to prevent network communication of those remote access tools, as well as through our EDR platforms. And from an endpoint perspective, specifically identity exposure, reviewing and disabling any default configurations that allow credential or identity exposure across our cloud service provider and across our used operating systems. At the management level, restricting who can enroll a virtual machine or an endpoint into our central identity store, and also restricting access to only managed, trusted, and compliant end-user devices. And across our privileged access or access for our administrators, restricting their access to and from our secure or privileged access workstations, and instituting comprehensive monitoring and threat detection capability across those secure workstations. And to summarize, attack surface reduction is not a single tool, not a configuration, and not a single control. It's a multi-layered approach through the implementation of targeted restrictions, hardening measures, response actions, and detections across the different layers of your managed identity, resources, network, and endpoints. And with that, thank you all for your time today.